There is a silent, haunting phenomenon that lingers in the dense forests along the border between Bavaria and the Czech Republic, something that defies biological logic and forces us to confront the invisible nature of memory. If you walk through these mountains today, you will find a landscape of absolute serenity. The air is crisp, the pines sway gently, and the high-tension fences that once bisected the world were dismantled over 3 decades ago. However, if you observe the red deer that inhabit this region, something deeply unsettling reveals itself. Biologists have noted that these animals, even those born years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, who have never seen a single volt of electricity or a soldier's uniform, stop abruptly when they reach the exact line where the Iron Curtain used to exist. They do not cross. There is a silent ghost wall etched into their DNA, a psychological frontier passed from mother to calf, proving that the trauma of a division can survive even when the physical object of that pain has long since turned to dust. This is where our human flaw begins. We believe history is composed of maps and treaties, when in truth it is made of scars we didn't even know we were carrying. This same sensation of an invisible barrier is what defines the very essence of what we call Germany. Long before Berlin was a city or Hitler's empire set the world ablaze, the region was merely a shadow projected onto the mind of Julius Caesar. Looking beyond the Rhine, the Roman general did not just see trees, he saw an abyss. He labeled the people there Germani, a term used to isolate the stranger, the savage, who lived in a forest so vast that the Romans believed it had no end. The tragic irony of German history is that it began as an external definition, a wall of words built by Rome to separate civilization from chaos. For the next 2,000 years, these people would spend every waking second trying to decide whether they should tear down the walls of the world to expand their space, or if they should build even higher walls to protect an identity that the rest of Europe always seemed to fear or fail to comprehend. It is the story of a nation perpetually searching for its skin, only to find that every time it grows one, the world tries to strip it away. As the centuries grind forward, a strange pattern emerges from the mud and blood of the Germanic tribes, a characteristic that set them apart from almost every other culture of antiquity. While Rome built marble temples and grid-like cities based on absolute order, the tribes of the forest lived in a state of organized anarchy. They did not have kings in the traditional sense. They had the thing. It was an assembly of free men, where laws were not etched into stone, but shouted under the open sky, and the rhythmic clashing of weapons against shields was the only vote that mattered. There was an almost mystical obsession with local autonomy, a fierce tribal loyalty to the clan that made it impossible for any foreign empire to domesticate them. This was the first time the civilized world realized that Germany was not a place to be conquered, but a force to be contained. The mystery that begins to form here, and one that must echo in your mind throughout this journey, is this: how did a people who so deeply valued individual freedom and decentralized tribal structures eventually become the most efficient cogs in history's most absolute systems of total control? The transition was not a sudden snap. It was carved by the agony of migrations, the primal fear of invaders like the Huns, and a desperate centuries-long search for security that birthed the Holy Roman Empire. The pattern is cyclical. Germany flourishes when it is unified, but that unity always seems to demand a human and emotional price that the surrounding world does not know how to process. we begin to see the first traces of a national paranoia, the Mittellage, or the middle position. The agonizing idea that Germany is always in the center, squeezed by enemies, pressured from all sides, a nation that can never truly sleep because its heart is the perennial battlefield of Europe. If you observe the transition from the Middle Ages into the Industrial Era, you notice Germany transforming into a workshop of terrifying precision. They took the discipline of their old military orders and applied it to science, philosophy, and eventually the machinery of modern war. But beneath this surface of technical efficiency and the sublime compositions of Beethoven, something remained unresolved. The questions begin to pile up like unread files. What happens when a culture of warriors is forcibly converted into a culture of bureaucrats? What happens when the ancient love for the forest is weaponized into an obsession with purity and borders? The tension here does not come from a sudden jump scare, but from the slow, persistent realization that Germany was building something far too heavy for its own foundations, a structure of such immense power and rigid order that inevitably the very earth beneath it would begin to crack and give way. By 1945, the ancient forests had been replaced by a landscape of twisted steel, skeletal ruins, and a silence so heavy it felt physical. The complete history often focuses on the grand maneuvers of generals, but the real escalation of the German soul happened in the quiet, shattered moments of the aftermath. Imagine the psychological whiplash of a German soldier returning from the Eastern Front to a country that no longer exists. He had spent years being told he was the architect of a new world order, only to find himself sitting in a makeshift camp, watching American GIs toss chocolate bars and cigarettes to children from the back of trucks. To these men, the most terrifying thing wasn't the Soviet artillery, it was the American logistics. It was the realization that while they were starving for a master race, their enemies had enough surplus to send ice cream machines to the front lines. This was the first revelation. The war wasn't just lost on the battlefield, it was lost in the grocery stores and factories they could never hope to match. But as the dust settled, a deeper, more sinister pattern began to emerge. The alliance that defeated Hitler was never a friendship. It was a marriage of convenience between two incompatible gods. The Iron Curtain wasn't a wall yet, it was a feeling. It was the way a Soviet soldier looked at an American tank commander at Checkpoint Charlie, both realizing that the person who saved them yesterday was the person who might destroy them tomorrow. The tension didn't snap, it stretched. In 1948, when Stalin choked the land routes to Berlin, he wasn't just testing a treaty, he was testing the resolve of a ghost city. The Berlin airlift was a 9-month-long heartbeat, a plane landing every 45 seconds, proving that the West would literally fly over the abyss to keep a foothold in the center of the Soviet zone. But for the average Berliner, this was the moment the strangeness turned into a permanent state of being. You weren't a citizen anymore. You were a pawn in a game played by men in Washington and Moscow who had never walked your streets. Then came the morning of August 13th, 1961, the day the metaphor became concrete. This is where the escalation reaches its peak of human cruelty. People woke up to find their streets severed by coils of barbed wire. Neighbors who had shared coffee for 20 years were suddenly enemies of the state. The tragedy of the Berlin Wall wasn't just the height of the concrete, it was the intimacy of the betrayal. It was the East German soldier, Hans Conrad Schumann, leaping over the wire because he realized he was guarding a prison, not a nation. But for every leap to freedom, there was 100 stories that ended in the death strip.
This was a 150-meter-wide wasteland of raked sand designed to capture the footprints of anyone brave or desperate enough to run. It was a masterpiece of paranoia, where the guards were trained to shoot their own cousins, and where the Muro 2000 project envisioned a future of lasers and chemical sprays, a high-tech cage that would eventually automate the murder of its own citizens. The feeling was no longer just tension, it was a profound, suffocating sense that this would never, ever end. The end didn't come with a bang or a grand heroic charge, it came with a stutter. On November 9, 1989, a tired bureaucrat named Günter Schabowski sat before a room of journalists and accidentally dismantled the most formidable barrier in human history. He misread a note suggesting travel restrictions